Well, when you open it, it has most of the sewing completed, but there are a few details that need to be finished. So we're going to use the fold arrangement and the fold angles in the property editor panel to complete the last 4 pleat details on here. So first thing, let's do the collar using the fold arrangement tool, which is this one over here. But first, to be able to use that fold arrangement tool, just like any folded line, you need to convert these baselines, which are blue, into internal lines. We're also going to separate the collar at center back, just so we can fold these pieces of the collar separately, because sometimes it gets into a little bit of trouble when you try to fold an entire collar at once. So I'm going to come over here to my collar pattern. I don't need to do anything with the stand, I just want to work with this upper piece. And the first thing I want to do is trace some baselines and convert them into internal lines. So I'm going to right click on this vertical line that's at center back, right click, trace as internal line. Just going to think about it for a second. And that one's done. I also want to convert this roll line to an internal line. So right click, trace as internal line. And while we are in the trace tool real quick, let's go ahead and trace the baselines that we need for our pleats, because these are also baselines right now. We need them as internal lines. So I'm going to select all 3 of these and trace as internal lines. Same over here. I'm clicking, holding shift, and clicking over all 3 of them. Then right click, trace as internal lines. Great. And now I just need to do the ones on the sleeves real quick. The sleeves are symmetrical, so when we do anything to one sleeve, it will automatically happen on the other. Select all of these baselines, right click, and trace as internal lines. That's all you need to convert to internal lines. We don't need to do anything with this directional arrow or these lines right here. Those can stay baselines just for referencing, but these lines need to actually fold. So now we are going to go back up to the collar, and the reason why we're separating this upper collar into 2 pieces is because when it's connected at the center back and you try to use the fold arrangement tool to fold it down, it gets a little bit wonky, or it can get a little crazy. Sometimes it works, but it's just easy to go in here and separate it really quickly. What I need to do is extend this internal line all the way up to this upper edge. So I'm going to get the Edit Pattern tool, just the regular one. I'm going to click right on that segment point at the end of the top of the internal line that we just made, and just bump it up right to the edge of the collar. It'll snap right into place, and that is good. Now I'm going to grab the Transform Pattern tool. I'm going to click off everything and select just this line, right click, and say cut and sew, please. Great. And what that's going to do is clearly it separated this collar, but it also applied sewing. So if I come back here to the back of his neck, I can take this apart and I can see stitches right there. So that's good. And we want to simulate really quickly to apply these changes. Okay, that's great. Now I'm going to stop simulation, and I'm going to grab the fold arrangement tool over here. It looks like a little panel of fabric being folded over with an arrow pointing down. We do not want to use this seam line to fold. That's not how a collar would fold normally. We're going to use this roll line that we converted into an internal line. So it's super easy. You just left click once on this roll line, and you're going to get a gizmo, a simple gizmo that has two arrows, meaning I can click and pull the red arrow down towards the green arrow, and it will manually fold the collar down for me. I want to make sure that I'm not causing too much collision with the upper piece of the collar and the collar stand or any other parts of the shirt. It doesn't look like it's colliding too much, so I'm happy with that. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm going to come over to the other side and click on this roll line up here. We're working with the top line. This line is a seam. We want this line right here. So I'll left click once on that. I'm going to rotate so I get a better angle of what's happening. And I'm going to pull this red arrow down towards the green. And I'm pretty sure that this corner up here, the collar point, is folded under, so it's a little bit, it's colliding a little bit with the shirt. So I might want to be a little bit less aggressive with this fold. And that should be fine. It should just work itself out. And I'm going to simulate. And it seems fine. Now what I can do is change all of my fabric to a thick textured surface, and that's going to create a white appearance to both sides of the fabric. You can also strengthen this if you want it to be a little stronger. And in real life, you would normally apply some interfacing to both of these collar pieces. And real quick, I'm just going to strengthen this so it pops out on its own. There we go. Right click, strengthen. Okay, great. To add some digital interfacing, in this program it's called bonding. And to do that, I want to click on the pieces that I want to include. So I'm going to get all three of these pieces. I'm going to go over to my property editor and travel down to Bond Skive. Click on the drop down arrow and select Bond. And then you'll have a drop down menu for what type of bonding you want, and we can just use a common fusible, that's fine. Skiving, on the other hand, is the opposite. So if you know what skiving is in leather, it means that you're shaving off a little bit of the thickness. So if we were to skive this, you would have less stability and less structure. So this is a close color match to the color that patterns turn when they're strengthened. So we have that bright orange for patterns that are strengthened, which you can tell right now that it is a strengthened pattern because it's got a brown color that is blending with that gray underneath fabric, or bad side, quote unquote, of the fabric. And then when you have something bonded, it turns to this light peach color, and you can turn this on and off up here. It's right here. Show Bond and Skive up in your vertical toggle menu. So I don't want to show that. I just want it to be there. I'm also going to unstrengthen both of these. Get my regular selection tool. Okay, and that looks fine. I'm happy with that. Now let's move to the pleats and the sewing once we get these pleated. So we just worked with the fold arrangement tool. That's one way to manually fold panels down when you have an internal line. You can only do that when you have an internal line. But now we're going to work with the property editor and fold angles. So the first thing we have to do to get our pleats into place before we can sew them is fold the correct lines of the pleat. So in CLO, the fold angles are determined by degrees of 0 to 360. And the thing that you need to remember is 180 is completely flat. So 180 is nothing, it's just straight across, no fold. Then 0 and 360 are the two opposite folds, inside and outside folding. So to do this, we are going to work a little bit in our 2D window for a second. And remember, I can click on a pattern or a piece of the garment in the 3D window, and it's going to show me where that is in my 2D window. So I know that I'll be working with this sleeve to get an effect on this side of my avatar. So I'm going to zoom into the sleeve, and I can click off to deselect. And so let's look at this pleat really quick. We have a directional arrow, which is great. If you sew at all, you know that a pleat at the sleeve opening right next to the cuff and right next to this placket right here, this would always want to fold towards that placket or that cuff opening. So this line right here, this left line of our pleat line set, this is going to get pulled over to meet this line. So this center line will be folded inward. And that is just some basic anatomy of a pleat. Sometimes there are 3 lines for a pleat, other times there's just 2 lines. You have the fold line and where it's going to land. This one has the fold line, the internal fold line, and where it's going to land. So there's an extra line in here. So I know that if this line right here is going to be pulled over to this line, nothing's going to happen to this line. This is always going to be the case. The last line of your pleats, when you're going in the direction of the pleat, this is our last line, that will always be your flat line. There's nothing happening here. And technically, I guess we could probably not even convert this to an internal line. Unless you were using the pleat sewing tools, then that wouldn't really matter. But we're doing everything manually, which I suggest, especially with details as few as this, because the pleat sewing tools are a little bit convoluted, and this is much easier. So we have the transform pattern tool. This is going to allow us to select these lines. I want to go to this first one, and I believe it's going to need 360 degrees from us. But first, let me just show you. When I clicked on that single line and I have my property editor open, I can see my fold properties. And underneath fold, it says fold strength. This is the amount of pressure that is being applied to this fold. So if you see something that's not quite folding as much as you would like it, just increase this fold strength. The fold angle is what we were just talking about. Which direction is it folding? And you have 180, which is flat right now. And you can either go all the way to 0 or all the way to 360. And you have the range in between there as well. But to get a complete fold, you want to go to the exact opposites of 0 and 360. And then I'll show you what fold rendering does in a second, but let's get this pleat in place. So I believe this center one needs 360 from us. So if that has 360 applied to it, I'm going to put 0 on this first pleat leg. Okay, let's simulate real quick and see if those are the correct degrees that we need. Yes, so this folded line is coming over to meet the last line, right? Okay. Now, what I want to show you is the fold rendering right here. When you don't have this checked, it's going to be a much looser, a little wrinkly maybe looking fold, but if you click fold rendering, it really makes it crisp. So this is one way to get really crisp lines, like you just starch ironed it. You only need to apply this one to the folded edge. It's the only one showing. Unless you want something to act a little more slender or just have less bulk to it, then I guess you could apply that to the interior fold as well. But I normally only ever do the folded line that's visible from the exterior. Okay, so I'm going to stop simulation real quick. And because we applied our fold angles to this side of the sleeve, our other sleeve is done too. Okay, so we'll just leave that for a second until we are ready to sew. Let's get our back pleats in place really quick. And this back that is sagging down like this, it doesn't like to apply the pleats to it unless the back is strengthened, which I'll add. The strengthening of a pattern always will help your pleats fold. So getting in the habit of strengthening your pattern before you pleat is good. Now I can click on this side and it's going to give me a blue dot where it corresponds with the 2D window. And you can already tell that this is the left and the right. It's the exact way that this is represented in the 2D window, the left and the right. We do have to do both sides of this though. So I'm going to deselect by clicking off in the background. I'm going to click on one of these lines, and again, this is going in this direction. You see the directional arrow. So if this is the last line in my pleat, it stays 180. I'm not doing anything to it. It's just going to stay flat. But I need this line to come over to here. So I'm going to fold this one inward and I'm going to fold this one outward. The center line gets 360. And this first line gets 0. I'm going to come over here, do the same. So this is our end line of the pleat on the outer edge. That stays 180. Center line gets 360. And this outer line, or inner line, I should say in this case, gets an angle of 0. So now I can simulate and see what happens. And does it look good? Let's see. Yes, that looks great. Let's move forward with that. Okay, so let's start by sewing this yoke to the back with these pleats. So I'm going to close my property editor real quick, although I do want to make these nice and crisp like a well-pressed shirt would be. So I'm going to turn on this fold rendering to make it look a little better. And now I can stop simulation. And now I'm going to get my free sewing tool. Anytime you are working with pleats and you need to sew it individually or manually, you want to get your free sewing tool. This is the best option to sew this. First thing, I want to sew my dart intake together. So this is folded in on itself right here. And I want it to, I want this interior, the intake or the depth of my pleat from here to here. I want to stitch that together. And the way you do this is by moving in opposite directions. You can either start from the inside and go out, or you can start from the outside and go in. But you have to do opposite for these both of these little sections. So I'm going to start from the inside and click on the middle point, move outward and click. And then I'm going to click one more time in the center and click outward at the other end. And that has applied the stitching for that dart or pleat intake. I'm going to do that really quickly to this other dart, pleat. So interior point going out and interior point going out. Great. Now let's sew the rest of this up. So to sew this manually, I need to sort of think about this, break it down a little bit. Here's my center back line, which needs to match up perfectly. And this is going to match up with this over here. So I know that this edge, outer edge of the bottom panel of my back is going to need exactly this amount from here to here. So if I stitch this from here to here, the software is automatically going to give me a suggestion of where to stop, and I want that. So I'm going to stitch clicking once on this outer edge at the armhole, coming into the first point of our pleat lines, and click once more. And the second part of the sewing relation is going to be on this point, and then stop where it suggests. That little blue popped up because it's telling me if you want it to sew exactly together, this is the length that you need. Okay, great. I can do that on the other side. Might as well get that out of the way. So going inward and inward. Okay. And now I have some options here. So I could just stitch the remainder of this from center back to my point, or vice versa. I could move from here to here because my dart intake is already stitched up. That's okay. But if I think about it, I sort of want to include this in this stitch right here. So I'm going to do this in two different ways, and it's not going to look different on the exterior, so that's why I'm a little bit hesitant to bring this up. But to be technical about it, if I stitch from here to this outer point and from center back to finish off this, that will be fine. I can simulate, and that will stitch together, and it looks fine. It looks completely sewn up. That's great. I don't have any problem with that. But you could say that you're not really including the little intake because we stitched this together and it's just a little sandwich in there and it wasn't included in that entire seam. So on this side, what I could do is, instead of just stitching to this point, I'm going to go one more so I can stitch the little pleat depth to this as well. So I'm going to start from center back and go to the last little bit that I have left on that seam, right? That's where we left off with our other sewing relation. And then I'm going to travel from center back to this last point, but here's the thing I'm also going to go. I'm passing up where the software is telling me to stop at that blue dot, and I'm going to the middle point because that's going to sew the little sandwich of pleat intake that I have in there. And it will look just the same. And I can simulate. And there you go. So it's up to you. The simpler way is just to go from center back to this outer point. So that's probably the easiest, and there's not really a point to doing that extra step other than a technical sewer's mind, I guess. So that back is finished. That's great. We can click on this with our selection tool and right click and say unstrengthen. Great. Now let's complete our sleeves. This is where it gets a little more complicated. Okay, so in this pattern there are already existing sewing relations here. So you can see that when I get my edit sewing tool, I can come over here and look at all the existing sewing relations. Part of the cuff is sewn to the sleeve opening, but there's a little section including the pleats that is not sewn. So you can see how difficult this sewing arrangement is. We have this separate placket piece that was appliqued right on top. It has this edge, and if you zoom in, you can see there's a split in between to allow for the cuff opening. And you want to be very careful when you're working with tiny nuances like this, because if you were to click on that other side, this one, when you meant to click on this one, you would be in a hot mess. So let me just show you what already exists here, because it's seems a little bit counterintuitive. If you know how to sew, it even takes you a little bit to figure out what's going on here. So they have this side, this tiny edge of the placket right here, just this little itty bitty area on this side going to this little area. So if you don't have this sewing relationship, you would need to click on this dot over to the last pleat line point, just from here to here, and your second relation would be from this side to wherever the software tells you to stop when you get that little blue point. Then your second relation would be this pink sewing relation that it's showing on my application, and it would be picking up from where you left off. So from this last leg of your placket, that point, all the way to the end, and then do the same. Pick up where you left off and then follow it until it tells you to stop. So you should have this already existing if you opened this file, and all we need to do to finish this is to grab our free sewing tool, and we want to close up this to here and this to the last little bit that will be after that. So I'm going to click once on this dot, this segment point, and come all the way over to the first segment point that I get to with my pleats. And the second part of that is going to be right where we left off with the pink sewing relation. I'm going to click once on that point and travel over to where the software suggests to stop, and click once again. Now the last little bit that we need to close up is in between our pleat and our placket. So I'm going to click once here and once on this segment point. And I'm going to come down here to where we left off with our last sewing relation, and I'm going to click once on that and once right here. See how it's matching up with the existing sewing relation? It's meeting it perfectly. That's great. Okay, so that's applied. And remember that these are symmetric, so when this sewing scenario is all good and dandy, we can hit simulate and it's going to apply it to both. So I'm going to press spacebar and look at that. That looks great. Okay, that is everything for this simple shirt. Most of it was already done, and we just took care of the collar and the 4 pleats, 2 on the back and 1 on each arm. And that is how you would do it.